On page 180 of the hardcover edition of his book, God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens claims agnostics and atheists have a better record of supporting racial justice in America than religious people do. One can only laugh at such junk. Hitchens based that claim on absolutely no evidence whatever. Did he ever take a poll? Of course not. He wanted his readers to just take his words on faith. It is a simple fact that every single person who was important in the anti-slavery movement in the United States and Great Britain was a devout Christian. Sean Willents, a highly respected history professor at Princeton University, wrote a book a few years ago called The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln. It received good reviews, and certainly nobody is going to call it the work of a crackpot. And Willents talks quite a bit about the abolitionists in that book, and he doesn't mention a single one who wasn't a devout Christian. He says the major figures such as William Lloyd Garrison, Arthur Tappan, Lewis Tappan, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and John Brown were all very religious. If you want to look up that book in your local library, Sean Willents' name is spelled S as in Sam, E-A-N, space W-I-L-E-N-T-Z. For the story of the British anti-slavery movement, look at the critically acclaimed book Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free an Empire's Slaves by Adam Hochschild. In case you want to look up that book in your local library, Hochschild is spelled H-O-C-H-S-C-H-I-L-D. He says every single important person in the British abolitionist movement was a devout Christian. Every single one. The only possible exception to the rule is Frederick Douglass. He said he was a Christian, but he committed adultery many times, so maybe he really wasn't. But of course, he did not become an abolitionist out of altruism. He did it out of self-interest. As long as slavery existed, there was a chance that he or his wife or his children or his friends would be kidnapped off the street and taken to the South and sold back into slavery. And naturally, he wanted to prevent that. There's nothing wrong with a man defending his own freedom and his own self-interest, but there is nothing particularly noble about it either. It's just what every normal person does. If he had been brave enough to go into combat during the Civil War, that would have been noble, but he did not do that. I've read the books by the big-shot atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, and Carl Sagan. They never mention any atheists or agnostics who were involved in the anti-slavery movement. There were lots of prominent people who weren't the least bit religious in those days. Guys like Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Mark Twain, Sam Houston, and Daniel Webster. But those guys never supported the abolitionist movement. In Britain, the pro-slavery movement in Parliament was led by the Duke of Clarence and by a man named Bannister Tarleton, both of whom were notorious playboys who were not the least bit religious. As for the civil rights movement of the 20th century in the United States, there certainly were some atheists and agnostics in it, I'll admit that, but I know of no evidence that they were more likely to join it than the religious people were. Hitchens certainly never presented any such evidence, and none of the other big-shot atheists ever did either. Surely the most prominent American atheist or agnostic of the 20th century was H.L. Mencken, and he supported Strom Thurmond's white supremacist presidential campaign in 1948. You can read about that on pages 21, 94, 95, and 112 in the book Mencken's Last Campaign, edited by Joseph Golden. Golden is spelled G-O-U-L-D-E-N, if you want to look up that book in the public library. Look at George Wallace, the leader of the segregationist movement in the 1960s. You can read about his life in a 500-page book called George Wallace, American Populist, by a journalist named Stephen Lesher. Lesher says that when Wallace was a boy, his mother made him go to church, but there is no evidence in the book that he was religious in his adult life. What church did he attend in the 1960s? Apparently none. His first wedding ceremony was conducted by a justice of the peace. That's on page 49 of Lesher's book. So where is the evidence that makes Hitchens think atheists and agnostics have a better record on racial matters than religious people do? There is none. In Selma, Alabama, on March 7, 1965, a large group of civil rights marchers were beaten up by state troopers. Martin Luther King responded to this event by calling on the clergymen of the United States to join him in Selma for another march. A historian named Taylor Branch talks about what happened next on pages 60 through 172 of his critically acclaimed book, At Canaan's Edge, America in the King Years, 1965 to 1968. King did not ask science professors to join him in Selma, but it was obvious that he needed all the help he could get, so surely he would not have turned away any scientists or science professors or science graduate students who showed up in Selma, but apparently none did. In the more than 100 pages that Branch spends discussing this event, he doesn't mention a single one. Instead, clergymen, seminarians, and nuns poured into Selma. A Methodist bishop was there, so were 3 Episcopal bishops, so was Archbishop Iakovos, the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church in the United States. So was the famous Judaist seminary professor, Abraham Heschel. Harris Wofford, the assistant director of the Peace Corps, was there, and he said years later that he shared a motel room with 9 Episcopalian priests. More than 100 Unitarian leaders from the Boston area went to Selma together. One of them was James Reeb, who was murdered there by white supremacists. A group of 70 Catholics arrived from Chicago. All told, there were more than 100 Catholic priests and nuns there. Professor Elwin Smith of the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary led the crew that cooked and transported food for the marchers, and when the marchers finally reached Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, they camped on land owned by the Catholic Church. So here we have it, a clear-cut contest between religion and science to see who cares more about morality. Religion won in a landslide. You see, going on one of King's marches was dangerous. You could be shot at for Pete's sake. Scientists are logical people. Why would they want to risk their lives for a bunch of strangers? There is nothing logical about doing that. Branch tells the story of 11 Episcopal Seminary students who went to Selma together. Where is the story of 11 science students who went to Selma together? There is no such story. James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King, was not the least bit religious. You can find that on page 53 of the critically acclaimed book, Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray and the Assassination of Martin Luther King, by Gerald Posner. If there had been anything even slightly religious about Ray, you can bet your life that Hitchens and Dawkins and the other big-shot atheists would be constantly talking about that fact. But they don't, because there was nothing religious about James Earl Ray. The reason for antipathy toward blacks is the fear of black crime. The Bible has nothing to do with it. Look at Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Both of them were highly intelligent men. But Madison, in his old age, said he felt more pity for the white women of the South than for the slaves, because, he said, the white women live in constant fear of violence from black men. You can read about that on pages 26 through 28 of the book Nixon's Piano, Presidents and Racial Politics from Washington to Clinton, by a historian named Kenneth O'Reilly. Jefferson said in 1820, in a letter to a friend, that if slavery was suddenly abolished, he was sure the blacks would start butchering the whites. It wouldn't be safe for whites to live in the South anymore, he said. You can read that letter on page 1449 of the book Thomas Jefferson Writings, edited by Merrill Peterson. Merrill is spelled M as in Minnesota, E-R-R-I-L-L, if you want to look up that book in your local library. In 1970, when George Wallace was running for governor of Alabama against a moderate, he ran newspaper ads that showed a blonde, white 4-year-old girl on a beach, in a swimsuit, surrounded by a bunch of 7-year-old black boys. The caption said, "This could be Alabama 4 years from now. Do you want it?" You can read about that ad on page 441 of the book George Wallace, American Populist, by Stephen Lesher. That, not anything from the Bible, was the foundation of Wallace's movement. Those are the facts, but Hitchens was not interested in facts. He just wanted to spread lies.